Welcome. This is the Triangle Apologetics community. We are in the Triangle area of North Carolina. So we're a group of men and women from diverse age groups, backgrounds, levels of education, and we are interested in scientific research and general evidence that points to God's existence, character, and the Bible's reliability. We lean towards STEM areas of research, but we're not limited to these. And there's our email address there, triangle-apologetics-community@outlook.com. Tonight, let me just go over our agenda. So some welcome. I've got a couple of announcements, and then our main presentation will be Christianity and Critical Race Theory by Dr. Neil Shenvi, and that's the cover of one of his books, just so you get an idea there. And then we'll do some Q&A afterward. I have two announcements, and then we'll get into the presentation. Number one, we've just created our own YouTube channel. We did that this week. And the reason we did that is so we can post these videos there. What you see there are the first two that we posted. So one of those is the one we did last month on reverse engineering and how that shows the ingenuity of a creator. And the other one that you see there is the last one we did as an RTB chapter. That was with Dr. Paco Delgado, and it was on the human microbe relationship. So you can get those videos now. After tonight, I'll capture this and maybe do a little editing to get rid of the recipes that we're not going to share. And then
It might be copyrighted.
that's right, it might be. And so I'll post that, and then I'll start posting. I'll going back to the ones we recorded previously, and I'll just add them to the YouTube channel. So there it is, Triangle Apologetics Community. That's our YouTube channel as of this week. My second announcement, just a brief plug for next month. So in March, we're going to talk about From the Biggest to the Smallest in the Universe with Dr. Michael Strauss. We had him before talking about some different topics. Let me just read that a little bit, and then we'll move on. Physicists have examined the mysteries of the universe from the size of quarks, less than 10 to the minus 19 meters, up to the distance of the farthest visible galaxies, about 10 to the 26 meters, a remarkable range of approximately 35 orders of magnitude. In Romans 1, Paul writes that God's invisible attributes have been clearly seen through what has been made. In this talk, Dr. Mike Strauss will discuss the vastness of the universe that we observe in the distant cosmos and the smallness of the universe that we probe in the subatomic world. He will talk about how both these extremes give us insight into the character of the Creator and consider some practical life applications based on what we learn about God through these scientific observations. Just a brief note about him. One of the things he does in his research is he gets involved with the Hadron Large Particle Collider in Switzerland. That's some of his stuff. But
Oklahoma.
He's in, where is he?
He's at a university in Oklahoma.
University of Oklahoma, I think.
Okay.
I think it's Oklahoma. However, for tonight, here we are. Tonight's topic is critical theory. So critical theory and its expression in fields like critical race theory, critical pedagogy, and queer theory are having a profound impact on our culture. What is critical race theory? What are its ideas about race, class, gender, identity, and justice? What are its origins and underlying influences? Is it based on false assumptions? Does it have legitimate insights? How should Christians respond to it? How does it compare with a biblical worldview? So tonight, we have the privilege of having Dr. Neil Shenvi here. He's right here in the room with us. He grew up in Delaware and attended Princeton University as an undergraduate. He became a Christian in Berkeley, California, of all places, where he earned his PhD in theoretical chemistry in UC Berkeley. From 2005 to 2010, he worked as a postdoctoral associate at Yale. He moved to Durham in 2010 to do research into non-academic dynamics and electronic structure theory at Duke University. All kinds of good quantum kind of stuff and everything. In 2015, he quit his job at Duke to homeschool his 4 children, although he still fiddles with quantum mechanics now and then for fun, just for fun. Yeah, quantum mechanics for fun. There should be a course on that. In addition to his duties as the principal of the South Durham Academy for Math and Science, also known as Daddy Academy, he tutors the master's class at the local Classical Conversations Homeschool Co-op. He's the author of 2 books, Why Believe? A Reasoned Approach to Christianity, and Critical Dilemma, The Rise of Critical Theories and Social Justice Ideology. He also contributed a chapter called Critiquing critical theory in the new book, Apologetics for an Ever-Changing Culture, published in January of 2025. And I read that chapter and some of the other ones. That's a brand new book. In fact, he and Sean McDowell did a live talk, and I was actually driving the truck, moving my mom's furniture here, so I couldn't talk. I couldn't say anything, but I listened to it in the car or in the truck.
Thank you, Dennis. Thank you guys for coming and inviting me to speak. So I'm talking tonight about Christianity and critical race theory. And it's been in the news a lot. And unfortunately, a lot of people don't really understand what critical race theory actually is. They think they might think they do, but they often don't. And so I'm going to try to present to you as neutrally and objectively as I can what critical race theory actually is and how it's actually impacting our culture. Here's an example of, you wouldn't necessarily say this has to be CRT, but around 2014, it began happening in our culture that pundits have called the Great Awakening. So you see words like racism, privilege, whiteness, intersectionality, other phrases like transgenderism, cisgenderism, ableism, all these words begin to be common parlance in our culture around 2014. And you can see it in other newspapers, it's all over the media suddenly, in government, it's everywhere. So, and these phrases, though, interestingly, are not new. Intersectionality was developed by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. It was around in academia for decades, but suddenly it leaked into our culture, this sort of lab leak event. Another example, this was posted by the Smithsonian Museum in their Museum of African American History and Culture, no less. It's the aspects and assumptions of whiteness and white culture in the US, and including things like emphasis on the scientific method, objective, rational, linear thinking, cause and effect relationships, and quantitative emphasis. These are all elements of whiteness, according to the Smithsonian. And after a huge public outcry, they took this page down. But you think, this is like a neo-Nazi manifesto, that science is whiteness? That doesn't sound progressive at all. Why are we paying for this in the government? But that's considered progressive to say that. What's going on here? Here's Black Lives Matter, the organization. When they came out with the official statement of beliefs, they put it up in like 2019, maybe, take it down not long after, but included this statement. We are self-reflexive and do the work required to dismantle cisgender privilege and uplift Black trans folk. We foster a queer affirming network. They want to free themselves from a tight grip of heteronormative thinking. And they sold shirts that said Black future is queer. This was along with another list of other items dealing with race, but clearly they saw gender and sexuality as intimately connected to race, even though their organization was primarily focused on race. So what's going on here? We saw this for years happening in our culture, and we couldn't put our finger on what it was coming from. So here I'm talking to you today about what is the fountainhead of these ideas that we're seeing downstream in the culture. We'll start with critical theory and critical race theory. What are they? Where do they come from? Then we'll focus on critical race theory in particular. What is it? What are the core underlying ideas at the heart of critical race theory? Talk about its problems. I'll focus on Robin DiAngelo, who's now kind of out of the public eye, but for a while was like this best-selling public intellectual. I mean, apparently there was a waiting list 200 people deep at the public library to get a copy of her book, White Fragility, which is an horrifyingly bad book, but it was super popular for months and months. It topped Amazon bestseller, topped Audible bestseller, Editor's Choice on Kindle. It was everywhere. And even churches unfortunately recommending it. And I'll offer some conclusions at the very end. So I'll start with critical theory and critical race theory. So here's a chart from my book, Critical Dilemma. And it shows you a timeline of these various critical social theories. So sometimes people call all of these theories, they put it under the umbrella of critical theory. They're all various forms of critical theory. And it goes back indeed to Marxism. So Karl Marx was the first true critical theorist by most accounts. But then later theorists like the neo-Marxists of the Frankfurt School, Antonio Gramsci in the 1920s and 30s, they took Marx's ideas and they applied them more broadly than just to economics. They applied his ideas to things like the culture industry, mass media. You have things like post-colonial theory, second wave feminism. These are all various critical social theories. They all want to understand how power operates to produce winners and losers. So this is happening over the course of 150 years. And today, all these various disciplines are fused into something that we call in our book contemporary critical theory. And so they've really come to be just one way of thinking about reality that's applied to things like class or post-colonialism or gender or truth and knowledge or education, critical pedagogy, or race or sexuality. But there's one set of ideas that's applied to all these different disciplines. So they're kind of united today. But we're going to zoom in on critical race theory. So I'm going to debunk a lot of myths about critical race theory that are out there. There are conservative myths. That's true. There are also progressive myths. One myth that I've seen repeatedly, and it drives me nuts, that critical race theory has nothing to do with critical theory. Kind of a name, I guess. Well, okay. So that I hear that all the time. I heard that all the time. That is nonsense. Here's a quote. Okay, this is a video on YouTube from 2019. The American Sociological Association had a panel featuring Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term intersectionality, and she coined the term critical race theory, 1989. That's Mari Matsuda, her colleague, another co-founder of CRT. And in the interview, she said, on the panel, she says this, that they wouldn't recruit at Harvard, they wouldn't recruit scholars of color, and that she and her colleagues declared an offshoot of critical legal studies. It's another critical field. They were an offshoot of that. We discovered ourselves to be critical theorists who did race, and we were racial justice advocates who did critical theory. Hence the name critical race theory. So this is the woman who invented the term, telling you how she created it. Because they're critical theorists who do race scholarship. So it's a video. I don't know. Look it up on YouTube. How close can you get any closer to the primary source? So I saw a pastor telling me, "Oh, this is nothing to do with critical theory." I'm like, it is actually. So, okay. So what happened? So the godfather of critical race theory was Derek Bell, the first tenured African American professor at Harvard Law School. He left the law school, and his students, like Kimberly Crenshaw, Mari Matsuda, and others, they created
CRT around in the 80s, late 80s, early 90s. It was indeed originally a legal discipline. So in the late 80s, early 90s, early CRT was in the legal field. However, a huge event occurred in 1996 with the publication of Towards a Critical Race Theory of Education by two education scholars, Ladson, Billing, and Tate. And that injected CRT into the field of education. And so today, 2025, CRT has expanded well beyond the legal confines. It's another myth you get a lot, that CRT is just a legal field. Well, you ever hear someone say CRT is just an esoteric legal field? That is not true. You see, I've heard people say that on MSNBC. It is a lie. Let's listen to Richard Delgado, who's one of the co-founders of CRT, one of the original scholars, in his book, CRT, an Introduction. This is the text everyone reads. If you read one book on CRT, it's this book. It's not the best, actually, but it's very prominent. They say this: although CRT began as a movement in the law, it has rapidly spread beyond the discipline. They name education, political scientists, women's studies, ethnic studies, American studies, sociologists, theologians, healthcare specialists, and philosophers who are all using CRT. They brag about this in their textbooks. The idea that it's just a legal theory is complete nonsense. And this is one example of that, but they are very emphatic that no, CRT has burst the bounds of the legal field and now is used everywhere. And they're proud of that. Here's another quote from that book. This is great. They ask at the end of their textbook, what might happen in the future with CRT? Where's it going to go? In 2017, they wrote this: CRT could become the new civil rights orthodoxy. It might become part of the conventional wisdom. This may, in fact, be happening. In 2017, they're saying this, okay? They talk about how people like Michelle Alexander, the book New Jim Crow, a very popular book, they develop critical themes while hardly mentioning their origins in critical thought. Might critical race theory one day, this is huge, diffuse into the atmosphere like air so that we are hardly aware of it anymore? That is exactly what's happened. So again, if you have bothered to read any primary source in CRT, that claim it's just a legal theory, it's only taught in grad school, it's very
That is nonsense. Robin DiAngelo, get to her later, went on an interview, I think it was on CNN, and made that claim. Oh, it's a very rarefied esoteric legal theory. I don't do it. That is pure bunk. And I'm just screaming, like, as this in our book, we have tons of primary source quotes just saying this is nonsense. And she must at some level know it's nonsense. But there you go. Okay, so but what sorry, here we go. So what is it? What is CRT? If it's not a legal theory, purely legal theory, what is it? We've narrowed it down to 4 big ideas. There you can find literature on either 8 tenets of CRT, 7, 5, 15. Here's 4 big ones. Racism is normal, permanent, and pervasive. That's number 1. Number 2, racism is concealed beneath principles like colorblindness, meritocracy, and objectivity. 3, lived experience is necessary to fully understand racism. And 4, racism is part of interlocking systems of oppression. Those are the 4 big ideas. Let's talk about those in turn. So 1, racism is normal. I'm going to show you some quotes. So this book, if you want one text that shows you the earliest co-founders of CRT explaining the core tenets of their field, read Words That Wound by Matsuda, Lawrence, Crenshaw, Delgado. You've seen these faces before. This is the earliest I could find where they lay out the core principles of CRT. This is like a go-to source. As they say, number 1, critical race theory recognizes that racism is endemic to American life. That all these things like federalism, privacy, traditional values, established property interests, they serve as vessels of racial subordination. This is a key idea in CRT from the earliest days. Excuse me. Here are education scholars, Harper, Patton, and Wooden. They say, racism is a normal part of American life. It continually manifests itself despite espoused values regarding equity and social justice. It's everywhere, even in progressive institutions that claim to be progressive and just and fair. They also are promoting these racist values. By the way, all these quotes I'm giving you are not just them speculating and pontificating. They're saying, what are the core tenets of CRT? This is their take on it. These are critical race theorists telling you what they are their core values of their field. Another example. Delgado and Sevenchik in their book CRT. This is actually an anthology, not the textbook. They say racism is normal, not aberrant. It's an ingrained feature of our landscape. Racism looks ordinary, natural to persons in our culture. Again, it's normal. They call it normal science. And here's Kumasi in a book called Beyond Critique. She says that race can and will change to fit a dominant group's interest. In this way, racist behavior is not an aberration in everyday life. Is often normal practice in deeply racialized social systems. So again, this is everywhere in the literature. Racism is normal. Now you might ask, well, that sounds weird to me because we live in 2025, right? Obama's presidency was over a decade ago now. I don't walk around seeing burning crosses in Klan meetings. In fact, those things are really looked down upon in our culture today. So how could it be normal? Why are you saying that? Well, Keith, critical race theorists have redefined the word racism. Here's what they mean by racism. When they say racism, what do they mean by it? Well, 2, racism is concealed. Critical race theory expresses skepticism toward dominant legal claims of neutrality, objectivity, colorblindness, and meritocracy. These things actually are mechanisms for racism. So this is in 1993, Words That Wound. This is really old stuff, 3 decades. Harper, Patton, and Wooden. Liberalism, neutrality, objectivity, colorblindness, and meritocracy camouflage how racial advantage propels the self-interest, power, and privileges of the dominant group. Here's Hartlip. He says that the overall ethos of majority culture promotes and promulgates a notion of colorblindness and meritocracy, but these 2 notions are mutually intertwined and serve to marginalize certain enclaves of people, predominantly people of color. And here's Stefanchik again and Delgado. Critical race scholars are discontented with liberalism. Colorblindness can be admirable, but it can be perverse when it's used to take away, it stands in the way of taking account of differences to help people in need. And critics are suspicious of another liberal mainstay, namely rights. So critical race theory is not, this is sound weird, they do not like the civil rights movement. Because civil rights movement was all about liberalism, universalism, right? Not judging based on people's skin color. They don't like that. They think the civil rights movement failed, and in response to its failure, they have to reformulate the way to get equal or equality for people of color. They see themselves as continuing the civil rights movement, but rejecting its ideology. Okay, it's a really crucial point. Their primary enemies in the academy, actually, interestingly, originally, were not conservatives. It was liberals. These were the radicals who didn't like liberals and obviously really didn't like conservatives. But that were their primary dialogue partners, where they didn't like liberals, who were saying things like, no, meritocracy is good, colorblindness is good. They're like, no, it's not. So in their view, what is racism then? Racism is as a system that perpetuates racial disparities. But colorblindness and meritocracy and equality theory and rights discourses, if they perpetuate racial inequalities, they are racism. They're mechanisms of racism. They're not a cure for it, they're a symptom of it. Okay, so that's a key that they see it everywhere because they've redefined the term. Fourth, lived experience is critical to understanding racism. Critical race theory insists on the recognition of the experiential knowledge of people of color. This knowledge is gained from critical reflection. And this is that's an important word. Critical reflection on the lived experience of racism. We'll get back to that in a second. CRT gives voice to the unique perspectives and lived experiences of people of color. Here's Kumasi. Blacks experience the power of second sight from the perspective of anti-Black prejudice. CRT framework recognizes the centrality of experiential knowledge as legitimate, appropriate, and critical. Okay, so we'll get to this later, but they really valorize lived experience as the way to know things in general, but specifically things about injustice. That if you don't have that lived experience of racism, you are kind of blind to it. You don't see it. And they say that critical reflection is important because not just anyone has a critical lens to see racism. So, because some people of color will say, well, I don't see racism like you do. You don't have a critical consciousness. You have to have a critical consciousness to see it because you're so blinded by the white supremacy that you're steeped in since birth. Okay. And finally, this is a key two thing. So intersectionality. Intersectionality is Crenshaw's idea, or term at least, and it is what fused all those different critical theories. We talked about queer theory, CRT, critical pedagogy, post-colonial theory. Intersectionality fused all those disciplines under one sort of major big framework, which is why today it's very hard to find a text on CRT that doesn't mention gender, sexuality, physical ability. You can't read a book on queer theory without talking about race and ableism. So all of these theories have sort of melded together into this new worldview on how to look at reality. So here we see it. So this intersectionality is a key part of CRT from the beginning. So here again, 1993 again. Remember, these are early sources. From the beginning, they were saying this. CRT works towards the end of eliminating racial oppression as part of the broader goal of ending all forms of oppression, which is based on grounds of gender, class, or sexual orientation. The interests of all people of color require not just adjustments within existing hierarchies, but a challenge to hierarchy itself. So some Christians, well-meaning Christians, naive Christians will say, well, we're going to take critical race theory, but we're going to apply it only to race. I'm begging you to read the actual critical race theorists who say you cannot do that. This is the earliest document you can find talking about what do we believe at our core intersectionality. You cannot separate out racism from sexism, from homophobia, from transphobia. These are all interlocking forms of oppression. They must be dismantled simultaneously as part of a broader project of liberation. This has always been part of their theory. This is why I give you, in our book, we have like 10, 20 quotes all saying this. Here's another one. CRT critiques claims that one can fight racism without paying attention to sexism, homophobia, economic exploitation, and other forms of oppression or injustice. So if you say, hey, we can critique racism without getting into the whole queer theory stuff, they're like, no, you can't. It's part of our theory. Here's Yasso. It's a very famous paper, 2005. CRT is committed to social justice and offers a liberatory, transformative response to racial, gender, and class oppression, and works to eliminate racism, sexism, and poverty, as well as the empowerment of people of color and other subordinated groups. It's not just about race. It cannot be. It is in their documents from the very earliest days. I just get nuts because I'm not even critiquing anything yet. I'm begging people, read the documents. Don't turn off Fox News, turn off MSNBC, just read what they've written. For goodness sake, I just one more soapbox thing. There are Christian, evangelical professors at major schools writing books about CRT who will ignore this. Will claim it doesn't exist. I'm like, at some point, I'm like, this is not accidental. You are leaving out the things you don't want us to know about. I'm trying to be fair. I respect them enough to say they believe this. I don't believe this, but it's there. So if it's weird, like saying, I'm telling you about Islam and not mentioning the whole, like, they don't believe that Jesus is God. Well, minor point. It's kind of a major point, right? It's kind of core to their belief system, right? Like, not mentioning Muhammad. Like, we're writing a book about evolution, not mentioning Darwin. It's kind of a big deal. You can't just ignore it. Anyway, so I'm trying to just show you what they actually believe. Okay. And then Kumasi, same thing. It's everywhere. It's everywhere. Before I critique anything, what are some positives? It's not all bad. We have a whole chapter in our book, Critical Dilemma, about the positive insights of critical theory broadly. We even talk about queer theory. There's something in there. You're like, okay, that's actually true. A lot of it's terrible, demonic even, but some of it's positive. So CRT, what is it? Race, this is a major point. They believe correctly that race is a social construct. Weirdly, today, there are people on the right who have to be talked into this. I'm like, this is Acts 17. From one man, God created all men. We have one flesh, right? We all share the same nature. But now you get people on the right who are saying, no, race is a real thing. They will be careful here. Ancestry is a real thing. Some people have ancestry came from Africa, others from Europe, others from Australia. Where, sure, that's a thing. But these buckets of black and white and Asian, those buckets are the social construct. I mean, the simplest one is this: Asian, the racial bucket, Asian. Do you know how big Asia is? Do you know how many countries and people groups and languages and religions are in Asia? Oh, they're all Asian, though. It's like, what does that tell you about anything? Like, they're at war with each other half the time. Or Europe. They're European. Dude, go back a few centuries. They're all slaughtering each other, right? These are different people groups. So biblically, there are nations, there are tribes, there are clans, there are families, right? But black, white, Hispanic, and Asian are not biblical categories, right? So that's what we mean when we say they're a social construct. Number two, racism, the real kind, has shaped our country's history in profound ways. I taught a course in American history 2 years ago to my students, and I'm just like, look, guys, if you don't understand racism, like real racism and real white supremacy, you can barely understand 200 years of our country's history. I mean, you go through the Constitution itself, the Fifth Compromise, Civil War. I mean, obviously, Black Code, Jim Crow laws, segregation. It shaped literally how our voting patterns for hundreds of years, how our Congress works, all of this stuff, outdoor college. It's deeply influenced by actual racism, slavery. As Christians, we have to be honest about this. It's just a fact. We don't have to hide it. Oh, don't be progressive. It's not progressive, it's being a historian. So critical race theorists are attuned, often correctly, to the way that racism has played out in our country's history. In fact, I would even say a little bit boldly, when you read critical race theorists writing about, say, the 1800s, that's pretty correct. They're pretty right about how they think about race in 1800s. Now, in 2025, no. But if you look back far enough, they're like, yeah, that kind of does fit this pattern you're seeing, okay? And we can admit that. And racism can infect systems. It can. The idea of systemic racism, if you can understand that in a certain way that's true. Chattel slavery is systemic racism. It is. You have a whole system designed to marginalize and oppress Black people. That is correct, okay? So the idea of a systemic sin is a thing. Now, how they think about it is wrong, but we shouldn't have the whole category biblically. There are laws and social systems and norms that can be used to commit sin on a grand scale. The Holocaust, chattel slavery, apartheid, abortion. These are systemic problems, not just, oh, that guy did a bad thing, individual sin. Sure, but it's part of a larger societal problem, a system problem. So all those things are true, and they point them out. But huge problems. This theory is fundamentally flawed, deeply, irreparably flawed. So what are some ways in which it is? Okay, racism is primarily a sin, not a system. This is a huge one. So sins can be systemic. There can be sinful and unjust laws and systems. That's true. But primarily, the problem comes from the human heart. In contrast, they see racism as a system of power, such that, for example, people of color are not racist because they do not systematically benefit from racism. So they would say something like this: racism is prejudice plus power, very common definition. Because people of color lack collective power, they can't be racist by definition. They can be prejudiced, but not racist, because they see racism primarily as a system, not as an individual thing. So that's what they often redefine the word racism. Conversely, so they'll say basically people of color can't be racist, definitionally. They'll say things like this: if you are white in a white supremacist society, you are racist. If you are male in a patriarchy, you are sexist. If you are able-bodied, you are ableist, I guess anywhere. If you're anything but poverty in a capitalist society, you are classist. And you can sometimes be all of these things at once. So that's the other side of it, is that this is not universal, but some critical race theorists very commonly say people of color can't be racist, and others will say that if you are white, you just are racist. Why? Because you hate people? No, because racism is about gaining an advantage from the system that are out of your control. You are stained by the sin of racism or complicit in racism by merely existing as a white person or a man or an able-bodied person or as a person with anything above poverty. You're just stained by those systems. And Chris would say, no, actually, sinful things are rooted in the human heart. We can, yeah, of course, human heart can then produce evil laws and unjust systems. It can, but the problem is ultimately traced back to the human heart. And no one is held accountable for things that just living. I just exist in society. I'm therefore a sinner. No, you're a sinner because you're fallen in Adam and you do evil things. Not because you're just there, you're just born. Oh, you're born. Society made you. Think about that. How can Jesus be sinless on these definitions? He lived in a patriarchal society, right? Is he therefore a sexist pig and therefore sinful and immoral? No, that's really bad. So the idea that we can be stained by merely existing in society, not by our heart, is actually wrong. Okay, sin, not racism, is pervasive. The way that critical race theorists talk about sin going to sound about racism, is going to sound very familiar. Here's D'Angelo. The question is not, did racism take place, but rather in which ways did racism manifest in this context? She talks about how cross-racial friendships do not block out dynamics of racism. Racism cannot be absent from your friendship, and no cross-racial friendship is free from the dynamics of racism in the society. And this was in her book White Fragility, the second paragraph. So she sees racism everywhere. And my parents are, my mom's white, my dad's Indian. So the question is, when my dad doesn't take out the trash or something, it's not, was that racism, but how is that racism? Or my mom, burns his toast. It's not, was that racism? It was, but how was it racism? Was it intentional? Was it secretive? Did she get kickbacks from the white people in power? This is insane. Like, could you imagine believing that your friend or interracial friendship is stained by racism? It's going to drive you crazy. It's going to make you horrified and paranoid and crazy. And it does. Here's another example. Whiteness positions itself as the norm. It refuses to recognize itself for what it is. Its so-called objectivity and reason, in scare quotes, is its most potent and insidious tool for maintaining power. We need to see racism as structural in order to see its insidiousness. We need to see how it seeps like a noxious gas into everything. Now, if you took out racism and put in sin, that sounds right. But they don't. For them, racism and sin are just swapped. It's almost eerily like a Christian worldview, only it's all about racism, not sin. So that, again, and we're going to see that later. This is basically an alternate gospel. It's another worldview that just perverts the Christian gospel and replaces it with oppression and liberation. Identity primarily in Christ, not ethnicity. Obviously, critical race theorists really want you to identify with your ethnicity or your race. It's really important to do that. This is an incredible confession, I guess, from this text, this anthology. They talk about how they're teaching classes about oppression. And sometimes they say students are like, I'm not an oppressor, or they'll be like, I'm not oppressed. I'm not oppressed. I'm a woman. I'm black, but I'm not oppressed. Here's their response. The binary terms oppressor and oppressed, for example, may raise resistance from participants who cannot reconcile themselves as oppressors or who resist the term oppressed. There are people in their class, women, Hispanic people, black people, saying, I'm not oppressed. Well, we struggle to find another language that doesn't trivialize the power and harm of the oppressive system. Whether you like it or not, that's who you are. Got to deal with it. This is D'Angelo. This is from that best-selling book that was recommended by major Christian organizations and churches, White Fragility. A positive white identity is an impossible goal. White identity is inherently racist. White people do not exist outside the system of white supremacy. This does not mean that we should stop identifying as white, start identifying only as Italian or Irish. Why? To do so is deny the reality of racism in the here and now, and this denial would simply be colorblind racism. So if you're white, you are racist, you're inherently oppressive, you can't identify as anything else but white, you have to identify as white. So what do? I strive to be less white. To be less white is to be less racially oppressive. Now we are seeing, I kid you not, the newest thing that I'm actually very concerned about. You have a generation of white kids who are 17, 18, who've known nothing but this from the culture. How are they responding? Two ways. One is ways to go utterly woke, right? And just be like, oh, I'm non-binary, I'm transgender, I'm so bad, I'm an oppressive white male. What can I do to atone for this? That's one thing we've seen. The other way is to lean in and be like, you know what? You're gonna call me racist. I'll just be racist. Why not? I can't escape it. I'm gonna own my whiteness. That's right. White people are better than you. I'm seeing that too now. That's the backlash. It's evil, but it's happening. And this is not, you're not innocent if you're pushing this stuff. You're driving them to do evil things. Does it make them right? Does it make it okay? But you gotta get rid of this stuff because it's gonna ruin people in both ways. Okay, truth primarily is in scripture, not experience. Listen to how Oluo talks about experience. She's asking the question: if some incident happens, a shooting, something, whatever it is, someone got fired, how do you know it's about race? Maybe it's about class, maybe it's just someone being mean for no reason. How do you know it's about race? He answers, it is about race, this incident, it's about race if a person of color thinks it's about race. Whether or not someone is fallible is beside the point. We are, each and every one of us, a collection of our lived experiences, and our experiences are valid. So her answer is, if they experience it that way, that's the way it is. If a person of color, what if I'm white? Well, you don't count that. Your lived experiences matter because you're an oppressor. A person of color, an oppressed person, if they experience a certain way, then it's about race. Here's Collins, and they're very famous feminist theorist. Identity politics valorizes the experiences of everybody? No. Women, people of color, or people, LGBTQ people, and similarly subordinated people is a source of epistemic agency. In other words, they have authority to speak from their lived experience. Who's on the list? Straight white men. Because they are blinded by their privilege, whereas everyone else it gives them special access to truth because they're oppressed. So, but of course, scripture, that's not true. Everybody has to be subordinated to scripture. Everyone has to submit their experiences to scripture and ask themselves, well, I experienced this thing, is it true? I submit my experiences, which I can misinterpret, to scripture and to reality. And they determine what's actually true, right? But this is totally untethered from that. If you experience it, it's true, at least for you and probably for everybody. Okay, then finally, sin is lawlessness, not oppression. Is real oppression a sin? Yes, but not all sin is oppression. I mean, I had a solid Christian friend, true judgment believer, great guy, but he said to me, sin is oppression. And I said, no. What about idolatry? If I worship an idol, am I hurting? Nobody. It's a grievous sin, though. And he's like, oh. It was just, he'd never thought of that before because we're so used to saying, well, oppression is that's what sin is. No, it's not. Oppression is breaking God's law and word, thought, and deed. But in critical theory, that's basically the only sin they see is oppression. And the only good is they see is liberation. Here's a very typical chart called the matrix of oppression. Lists all these different isms: racism, sexism, transgender oppression, heterosexism, classism, ableism, religious oppression, ageism, adultism. Then various privileged groups, oppressor groups, whites, biological men, women, heterosexuals, rich upper class people, temporarily able-bodied people, Protestants, and adults. And then the targeted oppressed groups, people of color, biological women, transgender, genderqueer people, lesbians, gay men, blah, blah, blah. It's on and on and on. The only good is liberation, and the only evil is oppression of various kinds. Here's intersectionality. This is from Kendi. This is one of the greatest statements of intersectionality ever. He also denied doing critical race theory, but he does actually admit that he was deeply influenced by Kimberly Crenshaw's intersectionality. He does at least own that. Listen to some quotes from his book. Anti-racist policies cannot eliminate class racism without anti-capitalism policies. To truly be anti-racist is to be feminist. We cannot be anti-racist if we are homophobic or transphobic. To be queer anti-racist is to understand the privileges of my cisgender, of my masculinity, of my heterosexuality, of their intersections. Right? He knows where he's getting this from. So that is how they view reality. You cannot just focus on race alone. You must focus on all these oppressions and dismantle them simultaneously. Okay, what happens when you mix CRT and Christianity? Bad things. I'll try to go a little faster here. This is a book called Can White People Be Saved? And they admit in the introduction that they are using cutting edge theory in racial and ethics studies and drawing on critical theorists. So people are like, well, no one's using critical theory. Well, they say they are. What does it do to the essays? Some of the essays in this book are okay, but others say crazy things like this. This is an essay called Decolonizing Salvation. And I just want to read this. What we presume to be true of the Bible is primarily the result of the history of European interpretation as translated into European languages. We would have a completely different understanding of the Bible if we read it through indigenous languages, translated directly from Greek and Hebrew. There is so much wrong with the statement, okay? Forget the theology, right? You want to hear an indigenous language? English is indigenous to England. Yes? Where do we get our Bible in English? From directly translated from the Greek and Hebrew. Yes? Yes, correct?
Yes.
What about the French Bible, the German Bible, any Bible you have today? They're all directly translated. What are you talking about? Dewey Rames' Catholic Bible, the translated from the Gulf? What is she talking about even? No serious evangelical thinks that this is crazy talk. Okay. I mean, the King James Version is translated from the Greek and Hebrew. Like, my goodness, what is she reading? Okay. It's acting like this is, we go around just like copying translations. We don't do that. I mean, the Watchtower does, if you're Jehovah's Witness, I guess, but like, sorry, like this, okay. But it gets worse. It gets worse. According to the European positivist grammar of truth, if proposition P is true, then not P must be false. Yes, that's called logic. Indigenous epistemologies are not beholden to such logic systems. Beliefs, even systems of belief that seem contradictory to European and Euro-American culture, for example, Christianity and indigenous religions can coexist in indigenous culture. Now, pay attention. She's not saying Christianity and indigenous religions, they seem contradictory, but they're not really. You can actually make them compatible. She's not saying that. She's saying they are contradictory if you use European logic. But if we jettison European logic, they fit together just fine. Okay? I gave this talk, or something like it, at a missions conference. Okay? During the Q&A, one of the missionaries raised their hand and said, "You're sounding very arrogant here, because indigenous people have their own way of thinking about truth, and this is your Western way of thinking." I was like, did you all hear that? This is what happens. I mean, any sane person reads this as like, so Jesus is God and not God? God does and does not exist? It's like, what are we doing here with this? This is insanity. And the people there are people going out into the big places of the gospel, and they're drinking poison here. They're like one syllogism away from abandoning the faith completely, because they are captured by this terrible way of thinking about reality that is just not true at all. Even a second thought, you're like, oh my goodness. But here we are, having to educate missionaries about you can't jettison logic. It's not a Western thing. It's not a masculine thing. It's a reality thing. Oh, yeah, it goes on. I don't. Oh, this is a different one. This is. He got mad at me on Twitter for quoting him. I just quoted him. Say, how dare you? I'm like, who said this in your book? He's like, you're misrepresenting it. I'm like, what did I just quoted it. Whiteness is best understood as a religious system of pagan idol worship. As idolatry, whiteness must be dealt with like any such cultic system. Its high places must be torn down and its altars laid low. If whiteness is a way of life, think about how he's defining whiteness. It's a way of life. Like, what do you go to buy golf shirts and go to Starbucks? What is a white way of life? Okay, it's a way of life into which its novitiates are discipled. Then a Christian discipleship that entails a deconversion from whiteness is necessary, if any, to experience of reconciliation with God, others, the creation, and ourselves to take place. Whiteness here just means sin. If you replace white with sin, you're like, yeah, if you've discipled into sin, be a Christian, you have to deconvert from sin. Yeah, sure. But that's not what whiteness means, guys. Like this is really poisonous. The guy's white, by the way. This is not some like, angry Hispanic lesbian. This is a white guy saying this. I'm like, what are you even doing here? I mean, and by the way, I'm not like, well, I'm not white. I'm half Indian. But if I were like Asian or Hispanic, like, brother, what are you talking about? Didn't you repent of your whiteness? This is insanity. I'm not being offended because I'm like personally hurt. I'm like, this is toxic stuff. Okay. Lastly, Robin DiAngelo, again, hugely influential. She's kind of fading out of importance now because people realize that she's completely insane. But for a while, man, like she was on Jimmy Fallon's talk show and going on CNN and stuff. So let's talk about her book, White Fragility. So the funny thing is, this is actually not the craziest thing she's written. I read her peer-reviewed articles. They're way worse than this. I'll give you some quotes from this. So I have to go through the literature and do this up. Okay, so first of all, yeah, this is her graphic from her book, What Does It Mean to Be White? She actually produced the same sort of graphic in another book she wrote too, which is actually a very good book for understanding the whole worldview. But again, oppressors, oppressed people, different oppressions. This is straight up everywhere. Okay, it's kind of thinking. And so you cannot just be against racism. You got to be against all that stuff. We don't even get into what adultism is here. You notice adult oppressing children? There is some scary stuff going on in queer theory with this stuff. This is how they normal. I mean, don't accuse me of being a scaremongering Sean Hannity Fox News guy. There is peer-reviewed literature talking about how children have to have sexual agency to have sex with adults if they want to. That's because and if you say no, that's perverse, you're like, yeah, you're imposing your values on the children, you're pressing them. That is in the literature, guys. It's not like me making it up. In my book, we quote it. But this is, how about this? This is this. So white fragility, she defines it as a state in which even a minimum amount of racial stress becomes intolerable, triggering a range of defense moves. So, white people can't handle talks about race and they get really defensive. Well, how do you express white fragility? How do we see it in action? Here's some examples that she gives. If you feel accused or scared, if you emotionally withdraw, if you argue, if you deny, if you seek absolution, you want forgiveness, you cry, you leave, you say, I know this already. You're judging, you're generalizing. I disagree. These are all ways to be fragile, right? But what's the only way to not be fragile? To admit that you're racist. So I say, you're racist and fragile. And you're like, no, I'm not. Oh, don't disagree, you're fragile. So no, you're right, I am. Exactly. It's called a Kafka trap. There's no way out of that. It's like the same, when did you stop beating your wife? Like, there's no answer to that question. It's just, I didn't beat my wife. Oh, now I know you did. Oh, abusers do that. Abusers claim not beat their wives too. You're an abuser. This is in the book. It's crazy that people think this is an amazing book. This is where it gets worse. This is a peer-reviewed paper that she wrote. It's called literally Beyond, this is a title, Beyond the Face of Race, Emo-Cognitive Explorations of White Neurosis and Racial Cray-Cray. That's the title of a peer-reviewed paper. White neurosis and the need of people of color to placate white neurosis due to real fears of white supremacy is the interplay of racial cray-cray, process that plays out in the racial dynamics of urban classrooms. Under the power of whiteness, the racial cray-cray becomes a socially sanctioned process of engaging in the lies of white neurosis that everyone is forced to perform. Basically, white people are so needy and so fragile that people of color have to placate them all the time. It makes people of color crazy. They have cray-cray, which is caused by the white people by being fragile all the time. Here's another one. Same paper. Thandika argues that raising white children to be white is a form of child abuse. We hope to offer a new approach to racial healing by affirming Indika's postulation of whiteness as a form of child abuse and tracing what happens when that abuse goes unchecked. I'm not going to comment on it. Just okay. This is the kind of stuff you find everywhere. It's cray-cray that we are listening to this woman at all, other than to say this is nonsense, right? Now, by the way,
Romans 1.
yeah, well, what I want to say is white fragility a phenomenon in some sense? Yes. You know why? Because humans are fragile. There's white fragility, there's black fragility, there's Indian fragility, there's male fragility, we're all fragile. And of course, you go around telling people they're racist, they're like, no, I deny that. Well, then you're fragile, right? But this is not really an insight. This is a way to beat people up and make them go along with whatever you have to say. And it's just wrong. It's not going to lead to anything good for anybody. So we should reject all this stuff. Okay, conclusions. I'm happy to say that a lot of evangelicals are finally recognizing this is awful. This is like in 2021. John Piper, well-known evangelical pastor, said in its mainstream expression, meaning as I represent it, like I'm showing you what they actually say. He read my stuff. So it says, critical race theory is another manifestation of the age-old enslavement of the fallen human heart to self-deification. I will be my own God. Self-definition. I will define my own essential identity. And self-determination. I will decide my own truth and my own morality without deference to any authority outside myself. This is key. And he listened to my debate with Russell Berry. These are the root problems of the mainstream, scholarly, decades-long development of critical race theory, which is why it is being so hotly contested and in that sense rightly contested. Amen. Because he listened to, I was at a debate on a program called Unbelievable with Russell Berry's a black pastor who's like, well, there's good and bad, and you have to define it the right way. And I just sort of giving him quotes. I'm like, listen to what they say. So, well, I don't agree with that. But that's what they say. Like, you don't agree with it. Great. But you can't redefine what it means. This is what they believe. And so Piper's responding to that. And say, yeah, this is terrible. You can't embrace this stuff. So what's the solution? Read some book recommendations. I recommend actually reading a spectrum of books. Don't just read the very far right or even moderately conservative. Don't only read that. By all means, read that. But read a spectrum of books. Why am I at least somewhat effective? I have read the books. I'm not telling you what other people told me about the books. I took the time to read these radical progressive scholars so I can tell you what they say. If you only read one side, you might be getting good stuff. You might be getting total lies. Who knows? You must read broadly. So this is a good book. I know Krista and Monique. I'm on the board of their organization, CFBU. Walking in Unity is a positive approach to racial unity in the church that's very critical of CRT. But they're definitely motivated by a desire to see unity. They're not motivated by just hatred of progressives. They're not motivated by saying, let's all just ignore race, not talk about it anymore. No, they want to talk about it. They want to actually have healing unity. They want to do it in a biblical way. So again, I recommend this book. I think I endorsed it. George Yancey, he's a friend of mine. He's an evangelical sociologist. He's more sympathetic to CRT. He's not anti-CRT. So you're getting a more liberal perspective on this issue, okay? But he's a huge fan of dialogue, and so am I. So that's why I like his approach, because not because I agree with him in terms of like the sociology necessarily, but because he's all about dialogue. So again, this is a more sort of liberalish leaning book, right? But it's basically saying, hey, talk to each other. He actually, and he will say, he rejects both colorblindness and anti-racism. He's like, I don't want either of those extremes. I want a sort of middle of the road approach. Again, you can disagree with him, that's fine, but he's someone to listen to. Brian Stevenson's a lawyer who works for the Equal Justice Initiative. His organization is devoted to freeing people who are wrongly incarcerated, often from death row. The book itself, I'll say this, I don't know anything about, I think he's a professing Christian. I know almost nothing about his other beliefs, about what he believes on other issues. This particular book is incredibly moving. It's just powerful. It's redemptive. So again, I'm not endorsing even, I don't know what he believes the organization. This book will get people talking about good things, talking about race, criminal justice, redemption. It's just powerful. And so again, this book itself is what I'm recommending, but I thought it was very moving. And again, you shouldn't be afraid of reading books like, oh, I can't read that book. It's a bad book. It's like, there are good or bad books, but you don't want to label every book as either good or bad, because wait until someone sneaks a bad book into your good book pile. Well, this is a good book. You thought it was, but it wasn't. What's a bad book? Actually, it's a good book. So it's better to read books broadly and then be a critical thinker. And then Shai Lin, again, more on he's an evangelical or formed evangelical, but more on the liberalish end of discussion. Why am I recommending that? Because that's what we need. We need a breadth of discussion. If you read Monique and Krista, it'll be very much anti-CRT. This one's more moderate, sympathetic to the concerns. But again, it's never wrong to read broadly. Just put your brain on, turn your brain on, and think critically about what you're reading. And my book, of course, this is very comprehensive. It's very long, but we have 2 chapters on CRT in particular and other queer theory, critical theory in general. And we have a new book coming out, not until next year, but it will be a shortened version that focuses on practical application. So rather than just critiquing the theories, we focus more on what can we do now. And so it'll be coming out with Harvest House in, I think, January next year. Title we don't know yet, but if you want to, this one, it is 500 pages long. It has 800 primary source quotes, often block quotes. So it is, I think, we wanted to be comprehensive and scholarly, but it's kind of overwhelming for some people. So we're making a shorter version. So if you want one of those, you can hang on for 9 months.
It's like Earl Truman and
It's exactly the model we're using. It will also be, it's not just a bridge. It is a brand new book. And if you don't know anything about critical theory, we'll get you up to speed on it. But the focus is, how do we think biblically about race, gender, sexuality? The title we're not sure. The subtitle probably will be asserting a biblical vision of race, gender, and sexuality. So the goal of the book is to help us think rightly about race and gender and sexuality. So we talk about feminism and LGBTQ and queer theory, all that stuff, pronouns, how to approach your boss at work, your classmates, your church leaders, your students, your kids, all in that book. So it's much more practical. And this is more theory.
If you get the electronic version, you don't care how many pages it is.
That's, yeah, we don't even know. You're like Kindle 13472. Like, okay, I don't know how far I am. All right. Thank you. So if you want more, it's my wife, my co-author, Dr. Pat Sawyer. There's lots of stuff online. There's my debate with Russell Berry. There's a good interview with my Pastor Mike Winger. A law review article on this. What if CRT were just legal theory, a Christian critique? So we were saying, look, it's not. That's nonsense. But let's hypothetically pretend it just were. Like, it's still terrible. So that excuse doesn't even work, because if you actually read the theory, like, this is bad as a legal theory. So, but we had to address that because so many people are saying, well, it's just a legal theory. It's not, but even if it were, it'd be bad. So anyway, and on Twitter, too much. So thank you so much for your time, and I'd be happy to take questions.
So I have a question.
Yep.
If you follow this line of thinking, and you say, okay, there's all these oppressions, and so therefore I'm going to do what I can to liberate, or whatever the solution is.
Yeah.
How will you know if you've done enough, and who decides if you've done enough?
Yeah, so basically it's a works righteousness model. In the book we talk about why would people get into this worldview, because it sounds so miserable, hopeless, as a treadmill, right? Actually, I think what's his name? There's a prominent Black writer, Coleman Hughes. I think his name is the title of his article is called "The Racism Treadmill." So you can never do enough. You're on this treadmill. You're trying to be a good ally, to be an activist, to do the right things, but it never ends. You're never quite progressive enough. And who decides? Well, the answer is the activists do. When you've done enough, the activists will tell you you've done enough. They never do. They're always like, you haven't done enough. You haven't centered us enough. You haven't divested your privilege enough. It's always more to do. But that's the stick. The carrot is, but the whole time you're thinking, but I'm a good person. I'm trying. Not like all those troglodytes out there, the racist white supremacists who are not even trying. I'm a good white person. So that's the incentive, is that you feel it's a form of self-justification. You feel like I'm cleansing myself, I'm washing myself. Yeah, I'm trying at least. So again, there's a number of appeals of critical theory, but I think the biggest one is it's a way to avoid our fundamental. We know we need a savior. In the human heart, we've buried our need to, we need to be cleansed. This is a way to hide that, to cover ourselves with fig leaves and say, I'm doing the work. I'm not like those bad people. So I think it is a problem. And this is why a lot of activists, we quote from an article called Sad Radicals in our book, talking about how one of these radicals, that he left the radical movement, and he said it was exhausting. You were always upset. People were pressing you everywhere. You never could do enough. And he's like, people would take advantage of your gullibility because you'd have these basically cult leaders who'd say like, you're not activist, you're not person, you're not radical enough. Follow me and I'll fix you. And so it led to this really predatory behavior in the communities. So it's a mess, but it does, I think, point back to our religious nature. We need to be right with something. If you take out God, take out Jesus, you make up your own rules for how you can be right. Yep.
Yes, I like to think about worldviews in simple categories.
Yeah.
And they are, a naturalism, just belief in what is physical, you can measure.
Yeah.
There is transcendentalism, like everything is God.
Yeah.
Then there's theism, where there's God independent from creation.
Yeah.
And then a fourth category would be like postmodernism, where there is no truth.
Yeah.
And I've always struggled to figure out whether I can fit CRT world into any one of those.
My son and I were talking about this just yesterday, actually. He's reading Sire's book, right? Hold it up. The James Sire for this University of Victoria. So we're talking about how he actually said, he makes two broad categories. He generalizes too, he simplifies too much. And in some sense, that's true because everything's very complicated. But trying to place critical theory into these categories, it doesn't actually work. Why? Because it's a fusion of Marxism, which is a modernist movement, right? And postmodernism. And we actually, in our paper with time on it, we're like, CRT has three roots. There's the Marxist root, which is modernist. There's the Black radical root, which is it's radical. And then which is a transformed society, right? And then there's a postmodern root to it, which is, truth is relative and lived experiences. But how can modernism, radicalism, and postmodernism all coexist? Because they're literally contradictory, right? And our answer is it's pragmatism. All they care about is what works. They don't explain. For example, some people ask me like, well, what is it? They say justice is good and oppression is evil. Well, what are they good and evil in? They don't care. Where do they defend the idea that racism is bad? Where do they defend that? Like, how do they? Well, racism is bad. They keep saying it, but how do they justify that? They don't understand. They don't care. They couldn't care less. And actually, I think it could be in Delgado and Simchick's textbook. I think they even overtly say it's not about some principles that we derive our theories from. We have a goal. Whatever works to get us to the goal, that's what we use. You can use civil rights theory to get to some liberatory goal. Great. You can't get rid of civil rights theory. Get a new theory. So they don't care about being completely contradictory, about having these totally incompatible ideas. They just don't care. So I think the postmodernism thing, when apologists talk about critical theory, they often immediately are like, here's an example. Critical race theorists will say, all truth is a power play. It's very postmodern, right? And the apologists will say to them, oh yeah, is that truth a power play? Right? This is very Kogel thing, right? You know what they say? No. You're like, you just said that all truth power play, and I said, is that power play? No. And then the apologists will be like, well, you're being inconsistent. And the answer is they're not. What they're really thinking is this. All truths promoted by the regime, the oppressors, those are power plays. But our truth is coming from the bottom and is liberatory. So you might think they're being inconsistent, but they're not. They're a deeper worldview, which is not just purely postmodern. It's not just purely modernist. It's a combination of the two. So you really have to spend time understanding. That's why we spend so much time in the book. People, I just skip to the end where they're all Marxists. I'm like, I get so frustrated because I got critiqued. I still get critiqued by anti-woke people for spending so much time nitpicking the theories. I'm like, guys, it's like telling a virologist, like, stop arguing about the virus, the protein spikes, and just give me a shot. I'm like, oh, like you're putting strychnine in your arm because you think, oh, the stupid theories. You have to understand the theories if you want to inoculate against them. And then the funniest thing, the whole saddest thing, is I'm now having to deal with the woke right. It's the new thing that's coming out, where I've literally discovered that there have long been, for decades, elements of the right that have embraced neo-Marxist thought. The same strain of thought out of which this all emerged, they have embraced it for decades, and now people on the right are embracing it, not knowing it's neo-Marxist. And I'm like, guys, we were against this like 5 minutes ago. But they're like, no. the woke right's a contradiction in terms because we're on the right. The woke just means left. I'm like, that's not what woke means, guys. Actually, funny thing is James Lindsay is an atheist, also a really anti-woke person, wrote a book on it, really popular book on it. It was a good book. But he and I both are like pulling our hair out because we're like, because we took time to understand the theories and understand them at a deep level, we're immediately like, that's the wokeness on the right. Was people that were just like, no, see, woke just means the bad people. And we're the good people. We can't be the woke bad people. They never been captured by it because they never bothered to understand it, which is exactly why understanding ideas is so important. You can't just pass over that step and skip right to like destroying your enemies step because you're gonna be captured by the very same bad ideas.
Yeah.
And we're looking at the fruit of what is being proposed, like an all-black dorm
Yeah.
on campuses,
Right.
you know, that sort of thing. Anyway, that's what it was.
It comes out of this. I mean, there's a lot. Okay, our chapter on race in our new book, we really go into detail about like, well, try to understand. First of all, understand the theories in the most charitable way. And so we give examples of like, so for example, you're like, well, that's segregation, right? Well, okay, but think about it. Hypothetically, imagine that you're in Germany. It's 1945. Just liberated all the Jews from the concentration camps, and the generals are like, you know what? The Jewish people who are being liberated, they can get rides on the U.S. convoys back to their hometowns. And you're like, no, that's partiality. Everybody has to got rides back to their hometowns. Like, but the Jews need it and you don't. Or it's 1667, right? And we have a Freedmen's Bureau for blacks only. Well, that's discrimination. No, okay, technically yes, it's discrimination, but it's actually okay. It's just why they were harmed. You're white, you're not slaves. So there are. So what we want to show is that's the reasoning. That sometimes the word they use is equity, but equity actually meaning treating people differently to be fair, actually legitimate. For another example, handicap ramps. I want to put a handicap ramp into this building. No. They can use the stairs like all of us. No, they can't. That's the whole point. But you're treating them differently. That's not justice. No, it's that they can't use the stairs. You're trying to give them access to it. Now, so that's the charitable spin on that, and that's legitimate. And so these some conservatives are just like, by golly, no handicap ramps. We're like, guys, just think biblically for a second here. But what's the problem? It's not that the equity is completely always false. Legitimately, you can sometimes treat groups differently, like handicap people. What's the problem? Are you really comparing a black person in 2025 to a handicapped person? That is insulting. Like, oh, boost their grade, they're black. Whoa, it's like having a handicap. The problem is not the idea that some of you treat differently. That's okay. It's biblically fine, right? It's not okay in 2025 to act like having black skin makes you handicapped and we have to kind of coddle. No, that's actually really demeaning. So we have to split the danger is people just want a simple answer. Equity, good or bad. That's all they want. They don't want to think, well, actually it depends. Let's apply a reasoning, let's apply the sort of categories, but it's easier to give me a snap answer. So yeah, black dorm is bad. But let's be careful in why we think that, right? Let's just not jump to conclusion because sometimes 90% of the time you have to be right. The 10% when you're wrong, you're still wrong. So we should be careful about how we parse those categories.
So what about South Africa in 2025?
I haven't followed all the farmer stuff and apparently it's bad. I haven't followed the news.
I mean, basically the shoe's on the other foot.
Yeah. So these theories, what I would say is that they are deliberately culturally bound. So and that's why they spread so virulently. So for example, people will say things like, well, critical theory, they act like it's not a worldview. It's just like this academic theory, or it's very American. It's only American. But I'm like, well, I get calls from Kenya, India, Indonesia, Japan, asking me help. We need help with critical theory. It's invaded Japan. But how? Kenya is 99.9% black. So how do they deal with critical theory? Because there it's tribal conflict. Everywhere critical theory goes, it takes the most salient social problem and then views it as oppressed or oppressed. Doesn't matter. It could be tribe, it could be ethnicity, it could be race, it could be gender, it could be sexuality. But it picks that as the foot in the door to then see this lens through which you see everything else inside, all the problems. So in South Africa, they would. So in South Africa, okay. Frankly, they're never going to feel like whites are oppressed in South Africa. They're not going to say that, but they will somehow. They will. So, what's that?
Killed.
That's right. Yeah, but so they won't do that, but they will find ways to like modify the theory. So, for example, what they'll say is it's not really whites are being oppressed; it's a class issue, or it's a relic of post-colonialism. It's colonialism that led the whites to have these problems because they were oppressing the blacks. So I'm just saying that it's you're missing out on the theory, and you're gonna misdiagnose the problem if you think, for example, it's always whites are the oppressors. Well, in Kenya, it's not because they don't have any whites, but it's some other group. So they will then modify the theory to make it fit their framework. So all I'm saying is it's not a commentary on South Africa. I've been following it. I'm just pointing out that it's don't be too quick to be like, oh, I can spot how it's going to work in this country because it does change. The funny example, post-colonial theory and feminist theory have real problems in the third world because on the one hand, obviously the post-colonial theorists are very anti-Western because you want to have indigenous peoples are good and the Western people are bad. But then the Western people are the ones who like stop sati, like widow burning. The English did that. The indigenous people are the ones doing like very patriarchal things. And the Western people said, no, stop doing that stuff. So, well, whose side do you take now? So they're actual feminists, they're actual Baba, I think was her name. There's a book on post-colonial theory written by feminists where she's like, on the one hand, I'm against the Western policies when it's anti-feminist, but I'm pro-Western policies when it's like, she's like, well, what do I do? I think that's exactly right, because you have to see everything in terms of like oppressors and oppressed. What if you just threw that away and got like a different framework? You can't do that. She has to split it into those categories. But yeah, there's a tension there between the different theories.
The one thing that does seem to be patently contradictory is that I guess here in America, Christians would be considered the oppressors.
Yes.
But if you go to Saudi Arabia,
yeah,
Christians would be the oppressed, and a pretty obvious disparity. How do the academics process that?
So I don't know about Saudi Arabia in particular. I just don't know. But I think similarly, it's like women in Saudi Arabia, right? They're oppressed in this. So if you look at it with feminism, it's a Western product, right? So it's very confusing. I suspect, I don't know, I haven't read critical theorists on Saudi Arabia, for example, but what they will tend to do is they will argue, and this is part of the theory, it's not about acts of oppression, like actual physical oppression, like violence, cruelty. It's not what oppression is primarily. It's ideological in nature. So ideas are oppressive and systems are oppressive, not actual acts. So for example, in, say, Saudi Arabia, where Christians are actually being killed, in Nigeria, right? They're being actually violently persecuted, right? But there's still, so they would say, well, that's bad. They wouldn't say it's good. They say, oh, that's bad, it's bad. But you have to understand, Nigeria suffered under colonialism, Western colonialism for decades and centuries. There's oppressive ideas that are still governing the society. So in that sense, Christians are still privileged because they live in a society that are still valorizing Western ideals. So even example, let me say an example like in the US. Here's a reverse example. Asians are considered people of color. They're not white, people of color. And so they're oppressed. But then Asians make way more money than white people in the US on average.
Your test scores
are higher, right?
Yeah.
So there's a large body of literature explaining that in terms of critical race theory. Because they're on the one hand, they're like, well, they're not white. On the other hand, they're doing really well. So the solution is that they have assimilated into whiteness. So they're actual, like, they're, I guess, trying to show you from Bonilla Silva's
They
book.
put that out the Jews too, I think, now.
Yes. Are the Jews white? The Jews, are they white? There's actually discussion because on the one hand, they were killed by the millions in the Holocaust, so the Germans didn't like them. But on the other hand, they're successful. So there are Jewish authors writing about the whiteness of Jews in the US. But the point is, again, the other thing I tell people too, and I give these talks, I'm not going to denigrate anybody here, but people will act like they're going to throw out some silver bullets. Just like, whoa, in 1 minute, you saw the entire, like, guys, this is like decades worth of scholarship, thousands of scholars. They've thought of everything. It's like imagine I were giving a talk on Islam, and you're gonna just throw out this one question that's gonna destroy Islam forever because you just have the answer. It's just naive. This is well thought through. There are no unexpected questions. Just throw out there, it just destroys the system. It's think of it like a religion or worldview. They have the answer. So it's like the atheist who's like, oh yeah, well, who created God? Like guys, come on. Like, do you really think that 2,000 years of Christianity is like now it's like walks in the who created God though? Like they got from Reddit, Google Reddit. So my only point, I'm not denigrating you, but I know it's interesting to ask those questions, but there are no questions you can ask that aren't factored into their worldview. They just don't exist. You can show why it's false, but you'll never find a new question they haven't thought of. They've thought of those things. And they argue too, like the Jews are white. No, they're not. Yes, they are. Like, these are open disputes within critical theory, for example. So it just follows a monolithic answer. There are certain things they agree on, but another one example is in CRT, there are two schools of thought: the realists, and materialists and idealists. Materialists believe racism is primarily about basically they're Marxists almost. They believe that racism is embedded in basically who owns the factories, who creates the laws. It's embedded in systems of power, right? Or real material relationships. The idealists think racism is embedded in ideas. So materialists basically, Kennedy's a materialist. Kennedy thinks that the only way to solve racism is to literally, with power, change the laws, abolish the Constitution, or something like that, something radical that changes the laws, and racism won't go away until we do that. D'Angelo's an idealist. She thinks if we just change people's thinking about racism and all these hegemonic power, these ideas, these narratives, then racism will go away. Those are totally different, but they're both well represented within critical race theory. So within this school of thought, there are two competing ideologies. They get along. They both agree racism is everywhere and systemic, but they're very different. So again, there are these camps even within the movement. It's not monolithic. But again, most people don't care. They're just like, it's all bad. Like, yeah, but if you actually probe it, you'll realize like sometimes Kendi will say, so Kendi, I read a Christian book, again, an anti-CRT book, but he talked about how Kendi thinks people of color can't be racist, which is very common, right? That's not true though. Kendi is one of the few people who says people of color can be racist. Anybody can be, I was racist. So because if you don't take the time to really understand the theory, you'll just assume they're all the same. They're not. It's like, so anyway, I'm not gonna, I don't want to be like, well, you can't do anything. Leave it to me. I'll handle it. You're just leading. I'm just saying that it's a very rich scholarly field. It's worth investigating thoroughly, lest you see something that's sort of naive, because you lose a lot of cred with actual theorists. I think average people know, but if you get an actual critical theorist, right, talking to you, and you're pulling out things you saw on Fox News, you're in trouble. No, I'm just saying. Our book is sort of quick reaction. The first chapter, we're not trying to denigrate you, make you feel dumb, and say leave it to the experts. We're not saying that. We're just saying you wouldn't walk into a mosque and you spent 2 minutes googling Islam 2 minutes before, and now you're gonna walk in the mosque. Just don't do that. You won't. It won't work, and you actually harden them. They'll be like, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. In the same way, if you go on to D'Angelo and start talking about how it's all just Marxism, she will tear you apart because you're wrong. It's not just Marxism; it is rooted in that. But again, we're trying to equip people to not make those simple mistakes. I'm not trying to throw the water, cold water on you. It is a very well established field that people have thought about for a long time.
Which is more popular, the materialist or the idealist?
I think materialist views were very Marxist. Their earliest CRTs were materialists, almost all of them. More modern critical racers are idealists. The D'Angelo's camp is kind of more popular today.
Would you say like the younger people, not the scholars, but the younger people tend to be more materialist or not? From what I've seen, they probably would be more active, want to change the laws. And stuff.
No, they're all activists. They all are, right? Yeah. The question is, what would you go for? So Kennedy's literally trying to propose a constitutional amendment called an anti-racism amendment. It would create an entire office of anti-racism, which would be able to veto any law. It's not racist. Yeah. He wants it. He talks about it on an interview with Ezra Klein. So it's a materialist thing. Whereas D'Angelo was the one who's me like, we need to just have more DEI diversity trainings in every college campus, every school, everywhere, right? That's the way to fix the racism problem. None of them are not active. There's literally, D'Angelo says there's 4 categories. There's racist, there's passive racists who are racist and they don't care. There are active racists who are racist, they're out there being racist. There are active anti-racists who are out there changing racism. Are there passive anti-racists? She's like, no. If you are anti-racist, you are active. That is it. You cannot call yourself an anti-racist. You're not an anti-racist unless you're active. She literally says there's no category for that. If you are anti-racist, you must be an active anti-racist or you're not an anti-racist. That's a very typical view they have. Activism is part of their worldview. Yeah. Yeah.
Let me interject something that may be a little controversy, but the whole notion of Black theology.
Yeah.
Wayne House does a nice summary. I'm just going to read about theology because a lot of people are not aware of this. But there's a lot of interdigitations of the auspices and outpourings and things related to Black theology that relate so much to critical race theory.
Yeah.
Where they sprung off. And I was just going to read this, and then I wanted you to comment on this.
Sure.
Because I'm hoping in your next book you'll talk about this, because this is the thing that's not really talked about, but I actually thought this was very helpful when I first read this. So anyway, their theology, and this is Wayne House, you probably know him, famous theologian that's done lots of charts and things like that. Excellent, source person, just like Neil. He writes, Black theology is a form of liberation theology that has at its center in the theme of oppression of Blacks by whites. It came out of the need for, quote, Black people to define the scope and meaning of Black existence in a white racist society, end quote. And that was by
It's Cone.
quoting Cone,
Yep.
exactly. It emerged in the last several decades in the wave of liberation movements as an expression of Black consciousness and seems to speak to the issues that Blacks must be contend with on a daily basis. And they go down, I can send you the whole chart with it, but basically what's interesting, there's 2 things on salvation and the church, which I thought was concerning. They said salvation is freedom from oppression and pertains to Blacks in this life. Proponents of Black theology are concerned specifically with the political and theological aspects of salvation more than the spiritual. In other words, salvation is physical liberation from white oppression rather than freedom from the sinful nature and acts of each individual person. Presenting heaven as a reward for following Christ is seen as an attempt to dissuade Blacks from the goal of real liberation of their whole persons. And then the church, he writes, the church is the focus of social expression in the Black community where the Blacks can express freedom and equality, also Cone. Thus, the church and politics have formed a cohesion where the theological expression of the desire for social freedom is carried out.
Yeah. So that's these. So I would say, be careful. So we describe it as Black liberation theology, and Cone's the godfather of Black liberation theology. Black theology actually goes way. He has a couple decades. He's clearly talking about Black liberation theology. Black theology goes back decades, like Scottish theology.
Don't you think that's infiltrated and just permeated so much of our Black churches?
Yeah. So
and
there's actually
their politics.
Yeah, there's a survey actually. It's hard to get data on this, but the only survey I'm aware of actually asking how prevalent is that in Black churches, certainly Black churches. And I think the numbers were about 1/3 of Black churches are kind of liberation theology, 1/3 of Black churches are health and wealth gospel theology, and 1/3 of Black churches are evangelical theology. So it's not all, and frankly, I'm kind of wondering with white churches, well, it's probably, unfortunately, very similar, but probably a lot of health and wealth gospel stuff. So it's a mixture. So I just want to be careful because there are actually interestingly, the Black churches are evangelical. The whole health and wealth gospel and liberation theology did not come until recently. There's actually, interestingly, you might find this surprising, one of the best books on there are 2 really good books on Black liberation theology, written by Thabiti Anyabwile. Now he's known as super woke today, and I would say he is pretty woke, as he's changed a lot. 20 years ago, he wrote 2 books. One was called The Decline of African American Theology, where he talks about how originally the earliest Black preachers and earliest Black churches were totally evangelical, adherence to the Bible, the new birth regeneration, all the evangelical, recognize all of it, right? And it's not until the 1920s when liberation theology began. It's more like the 60s, but it gradually shifted. And then with the health and wealth gospel and the liberation theology, that's a more recent thing. And he's right. The whole book is they argue that we have to return to evangelical theology. And he wrote a second book called Reviving the Black Church, which is a practical tips on how to get the Black church out of the liberation theology, health and wealth gospel stuff. And you read this now, you're like, it's really good. But his only point there is we have to be careful because you don't want to lump all Black churches in with yeah. And so, and even Black theology, a lot of times there was Black theology. We would argue that ultimately there's not Black, white, Asian theology. There's just good theology and bad theology. But that said, you talk about Scottish theology. You're like, yeah, I know what that means. You're not like, oh, they have a special insight. No, just Scottish theology comes from Scotland. German theology, Reformation theology. So it's fine to categorize it that way. But the point is that Black liberation theology, okay, this is really interesting. We actually have some of that in this book. I've read 4 books by Cohn, and there are incredible similarities with critical race theory and neo-Marxist thought and Cohn. Now, Cohn claims he's not a Marxist. He didn't ever read Marx, but you can see the ideas that are absolutely there. And interestingly, I've had people email me about, well, what do I do? I want to do a master's thesis or a PhD thesis. What should I do it on? There's one topic I always point out. Paulo Freire was the father of critical pedagogy. He was a famous, he did literacy. So his book, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, is like still 1 million copies. It is, if you go to education school to be an educator, you will read his book. So literally on the cover, it says over 1 million copies sold. It was incredibly important. Sorry, I'll go back. So he's writing, So Paulo Freire is this guy, critical pedagogy, right? Totally Marxist thought, totally neo-Marxist thought, liberation of the students from the teachers, the bank of education is oppressive, all this stuff, totally critical theory. And he knows it, right? He read, we have a first-hand account of it in here. He read Cohn's A Black Theology of Liberation, one of his first books. He read that book on like a train, read it all in one night, was blown away by this. He never met Cohn, right? So it's writing to him. Freire wrote the foreword to Cohn's next book. The father of critical pedagogy immediately knew this guy is doing what I'm doing and wrote the foreword, the preface to one of his next books, right? So there's incredible similarities there. Again, I had to, people were like, no, you're seeing things, it's not true. But I found that fact. I was like, yes, I knew it. So there is a lot of overlap between Black liberation theology, which again originated with Cohn was writing in this, I think 69 was his first book, 70 was his second book. I have to look back at my notes. But yeah, he was absolutely influenced by Marxist ideas. He claims not to be Marxist, but he's certainly, and the books themselves are wholly heretical. They're awful. Again, don't say that if you haven't read the books. People be like, Cohn's a heretic. I'm like, oh yeah, well, why? I heard Neil say. At the very least, I had. Oh, this is a little more thing about Cohn. So yeah, what he says is true. I just be careful. It's not all Black theologian, all Black theology.
Yes.
Huge in this country, started by the Black church.
Yeah. So but the last thing I'll say is this: I posted when I was reading Cohn. So I wrote a review of his books. And I sort of blew up. How dare you critique Cohn? You're white. I'm like, I'm not white. Well, you shouldn't be doing it anyway. You're not Black. They got angry. The review didn't understand Cohn. You don't understand what he's saying. So like, I'm reading a bunch of his books to understand it. So I'm like, next book I read, not going to do a review. I'm just going to post direct quotes, no commentary, nothing. Right? If I write a review, which is literally, I call it quotes from Cohn's, whatever it was. I post like literally, I probably didn't, it's probably a copyright law violation, but I posted like 1,000 words of quotes from his book. The book is like 40,000 words. I posted like 2.5% of his book, right? The quotes, they were really bad quotes, but I posted them. The same people were like, you're taking him out of context. I'm like, this is like 1,000 words. It's 2% of his book. You hear these quotes, and I'm ripping them out of context. And you explain to me what these things mean. But it was just incredible the pushback I got. I'm like, but I'm begging people to read. I'm a scientist. I don't read primary research. I don't care about them. I write things from first principles. But when it comes to humanities research, read the primary sources. It gives you this tremendous leg up on people because they haven't read them. They're yelling at you about them. Like, have you read this book? No, but I saw a review of it one time. It's like, anyway. So there's tons of riffraff. I guess I feel like this is genuinely a master's PhD thesis. Go read Cohn and read Fieri and find out all you can about the relationship because that's huge. And yeah, Cohn is very influential in, I mean, he's the father of Black liberation theology, and definitely in our book we talk about how a lot of those, I mean, liberation theology is Latin American. Cohn then picked it up and turned it into Black liberation theology later. But it has really captivated a lot of the mainline churches, yes. Evangelical churches will kind of pick and choose from Cohn a little bit. And his most recent book was called Crossing the Lynching Tree. And ironically, it wasn't as bad as his other books, his older books were. And partly is because in that book, he will actually spend most of his time talking about other people's theology, not his own. So a lot of people would read that book and be like, well, some of what he says is like he's quoting old hymns and spirituals that are actually excellent, like, Jesus, love of my soul, or Jesus. This is good theology. But his own views are kind of hidden in that book. And so when you read that book, you're kind of like, well, it doesn't sound bad. I mean, it's kind of liberalish. But then you go back to the older stuff, like, oh, that's the foolproof stuff. Anyway, but there's lots there. Another weird name I'm going to throw out is Anthony Bradley, who is also known as like this kind of woke-ish, kind of prickly guy, but wrote a whole book on it's called what's it called? I think it's called Deconstructing Black Liberation Theology, something like that. But
Something like that.
But the funny thing is, I know a guy who's very, very anti-woke, and he saw Anthony Bradley's book on a book list at Southeastern. So Southeastern, Walter Strickland's a professor there, and he's teaching a course on Black liberation theology, right? It's the purpose of the course is to teach the theory. And he has them reading a bunch of books about it, right? And he has them reading code. And so this guy who's super anti-woke was like, they're teaching Black liberation theology. But I'm like, when you teach a course on any topic, read the primary sources, right? I don't understand, and it'd be irresponsible not do that. I can't imagine teaching a course on Black liberation theology and not reading anybody who's actually Black liberation theology. So I'm like, that doesn't mean anything. What was actually taught in the course? It's good, it's bad. I mean, but then also one of the books that was taught was Anthony Bradley's book. And this guy was like, they're teaching Bradley. They're like, Bradley. I'm like, have you read that book? He's like, no, but Bradley's super woke. I'm like, that is a whole book about how it's bad. You wouldn't, I mean, I get why you might think Bradley was teaching. But the point is just like in more these sources. You can't look at a book list and be like, I mean, look at our footnotes. What do you think? I mean, I had our editor, I'm sorry, I'm ranting. Our editor, we're in manuscript, wrote back to us.
That's why we came in person.
You want to rant? Okay. Our editor wrote back to us and he goes, guys, the book's great. You need to tell people that you don't believe these theories right away.
Right.
Because the first introduction is pretty clear we're anti-woke. But once you get into the book, we're quoting these theorists, we're quoting about length, we're talking about we have a whole chapter in chapter 7, it's all about the positive insights. And he's like, if you don't tell people that you don't like these ideas, they're gonna think you're promoting them. And I'm like, so we are like, okay, Steve, and so we put in like a few paragraphs here. Every few chapters, we stick a paragraph at the end of the chapter. Just so you guys know, we're supporting these ideas, we're presenting them fairly, right? Even then, one of our first reviewers told us he read the whole book, right? So at the end of it, we're like totally down on these theories. But he was like reading it, and I got like halfway through, and I thought, what's happened to Shenvi? What has Sawyer done to him? He's totally woke. And I was like, look, that is a compliment because it shows you that we're presenting the theories accurately. You don't even know where we stand. We're just telling you what they say. At the end, of course, we tell the whole thing happens to terrible theories. But I just feel like, that is it's a mark of good scholarship. We're not putting ourselves into the book. We're putting theorists into the book. I mean, you read them and then telling you our side later, independently, and you decide what you think about the theories. Anyway, but just read primary sources. It's one of my main themes, read primary sources.
So what's the end goal for these folks? What does a perfect world look like?
Yeah.
one of the earliest criticisms of critical race theorists in the 90s by the liberals was all you do is critique stuff and break stuff. What's your positive outlook? What's your goal for the utopia? What are you gonna even do? What are you gonna build? That was the liberals, even progressive scholars were taking these radicals attacks, but they're like, all you do is want to smash stuff and break stuff and how bad everything is. What is your vision for the future, for actual changes? What do you want? How do you want the law better? It's so terrible. Okay, what do you want to do? Nothing. They don't have answers. Then they basically, like, Kennedy even said, this is insane. Kennedy did an interview on wanting, I think it's like wanting to abolish the capital gains tax because it's racist. And he's like, why? Why is it racist? Well, because white people invest more money in the stock market and they have to pay these taxes. And so if you abolish that, there's something that basically boiled down to if it benefits whites, it's racist. And so we get rid of it and then it'll stop benefiting whites. But then the guy was like, but what if it somehow, it was Ezra Kime, but he's like, but what if you pass this law to make it more equitable and to benefit people of color and to not benefit whites, pass that law, but it backfires and actually whites do better under the law. Would that then have been a racist law that you just passed? He's like, yeah. We have to then go back. But it's completely ad hoc. Just try stuff. And if it doesn't do what you want to do, just to go back. There's no principle behind it. They're totally pragmatic. It's like just keep doing stuff until whatever you want, the outcome you want happens. No theory, no morality, no, we can't do that. That would be unjust. I always say, if you use all your only thing is outcome, all you care about is outcome. You go, well, there's a big wealth disparity between whites and blacks. It's huge. It's like 11 times. Okay, let's fix that. Well, how can you fix that? They're like, well, we pass these laws, we change the incentive structure, we have DEI training. Like, I got a simpler solution. Kill half the whites and give all this stuff to black people, right? Oh, you said, well, that's immoral. Okay, but you're the one who has an outcome-based theory of everything, right? If all you care about is outcome, then tell me why it's wrong. Or, there's not enough black students in this school, right? I'm okay, that's fair. We can change that. Well, just expel half the white students. Now your percentages are up, right? No one wants to do that. But see, that's the problem with outcome-based, outcome-only theories. They're consequentialist because we all know there are certain terribly immoral things that we could do to get the right outcomes. But you got to bring that up because they will talk as if they will just only talk about outcomes. All they talk about. But you have to remind them you don't really believe that. No critical race theories, but yeah, just kill the white people. They're not going to say that. But they talk like anything's fair game. There's no constraints on justice. Justice is all outcome based. So yeah, you have to point that out to them because they will keep going on and on and on, like Kennedy does about all these laws they're going to pass and what they're going to do, and all they have is some hazy vision of progress that may or may not work, right? So it's bad, and that's part of I like Monique and Kristen because some of us actually care about helping people. Like actually care about racism and don't like it, and some of us want to actually bless the black community and see the social problems that are in the black community fixed. We like that. It's a good thing. And we don't want to, there are people on the right that just couldn't care less about racism and couldn't care less about actually doing anything to benefit people. But we do. But this is a terrible way to do it. So this is a terrible way to approach the problem. You have a question, Ethan?
No, I'll answer the part later.
Okay.
You're playing.
So it sounds like it's
When I'm king, I'm gonna require that all marriages be interracial. So we'll get rid of.
Joel Berry's the editor of the Babylon Bee, and he made it. He's a comedian, so he made a joke like, "We just mandate everyone gets married interracially, and all the problems go away." He got screamed at. He was like, "You did." Yeah, and there are some super racist people out there. All anonymous on Twitter, but the problem is other talks I've given, the evangelicals are way behind in terms of actual biblical interracial marriage. The average non-Christian. The support for interracial marriage for non-Christians is like 97%, the highest ever been. For evangelicals, it's holding steady at like 80%. So 3% of non-Christians are against interracial marriage, but like 20% of church-going evangelicals are still against it. And you're like, guys, I don't know. I don't even know what to do. Like, I don't hide that. I'm like, guys, look, this is a problem. Like, yeah. I get you don't have to hate black people to not want interracial marriage to happen. I get that. You don't do like awful bigot just burning crosses. I get that, but it's still not thinking properly about race. Like, I'm not like one of these firebrands that like everyone's racist and white evangelicals are awful and whatever. No, I get that, but we have to be honest that this is a problem in the church. Like, we have to deal with it. We can't just hide it. it's not only progressives who are like in favor of being kind, and race mixing. Like, come on, give me a break, guys. So yeah, so I'm unlike a lot of the anti-woke people. I'm like, yeah, there are problems out there. Let's not be silly, but let's just not do this.
So it still points to John's question though, since there doesn't appear to be an actual end game, like here's our target, and once we get here, then everything's good. Since they don't have that, it just points back to a treadmill.
Yeah.
Whereas in Christianity, there's an ultimate redemption and heaven and all the stuff that comes later. And that's, I mean, it's a known target.
Right.
And it's a good target.
Yeah. That's a long been a criticism. The other thing too is that once one social problem gets solved, they create a new one. This is why the whole transgender thing, 20 years ago, the gay liberation stuff is marriage, that kind of stuff. But then actually, if you look at, I think I found an old version of those charts, like the oppression charts. And in the newer edition, they had to update it because they'd put like men oppress women. They're like, but then suddenly they're like, no. Cis men oppress, but they had to change it because they were calling it misgendered a category, but you can see it even evolving. Like in our new book, we have the genderbread person, don't get into that, but we have these 4 or 5 different versions, like 1.1, literally label 1.1, 2.0, 2.1, 2.3b, but you can see the genderbread person evolve as they add more categories. First you have gender identity, gender expression, gender whatever, then you have biological sex, then they become 4 categories, and it becomes 5 categories, then 5 categories and a checkbox, and it goes from being like a spectrum to having 2 arrows that are independent. But it's amazing within the course of like 10 years. Even the cutting edge theorists have to update their graphics because the footnotes is just like there's a rival gender unicorn, and the footnote to the gender unicorn created by other groups says the gender bread person that leaves out indigenous genders, and there's some criticism of how it's patriarchal. Even they're not radical enough yet. So yeah, it's just never ending absolution, never ending repentance, and it is weird to think that people are so we're actually talking in the car. They're so desperate for salvation that they'll believe anything. Just please heal me, please fix me, please forgive me. I'll do anything. Like they're longing. Well, they're not longing. They're depraved, but there's a need. They know there's a need for something. And they'll put anything in that hole to fill it up.
And you said 458.
Oh yeah, that's right.
When our hearts are not filled with the gospel, I don't have one of that. They will more easily be filled with a replacement.
Yeah, right.
An idol.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other
Chester
questions? I realize
said that.
I had a question, Dr. Shenvi.
Yep.
If you can hear me, I'm the person online here. I just had a quick question related to what you were touching on about equality. I think you were touching equality and equity. Equality, as I understand it, is Martin Luther King's vision for equal opportunity for all, a good thing. Equity, as I understand it, is enforced equal outcomes. And I think it was the Seattle school system a few years back noticed that there were certain races that were predominating in their AP classes, I think it was, and other races were not. And they said, well, that must be racist. And so they got rid of the AP program. It's like, let's lower the bar for everybody. Not a good thing. So my question is, can you actually provide a definition of the difference between equality and equity for those that tend to kind of mix them up or treat them as the same word? They sound similar, but they're obviously not. Can you provide a definition of the difference?
So equality means treating everyone equally. That is a liberal perspective, right? It's a universalist. It's Martin Luther King's perspective on. Actually, it's going back even before that. You have other black abolitionists, black former slaves, talking about that kind of equality, treating everyone equally. Critical race theory rejects that, and equity refers to treating differently situated people differently to achieve equitable goals, right? That's circular. Yes, it is. But they want to explicitly allow for different treatment. And I mentioned it, I think if you were here earlier, in some cases, equity is actually reasonable, like for handicap ramps. You don't want to treat people in wheelchairs and people without wheelchairs equally. Like everyone can use the stairs. Well, that's nonsense. You build wheelchair ramps, not because you're discriminating against people that can walk, but you see a real actual need, and you want to get equal access by treating handicapped people, giving them special wheelchair ramps. That's fine. There are cases like that where it's legitimate. But what critical race theorists do is they then act like blacks and Hispanics are like the handicapped people. They need to be given special treatment, different treatment, because they're socially oppressed. And what I would say, obviously, that's wrong, because black people are not inherently disadvantaged over whites or Asians. Now they can be. There's poverty. There are other situations, there are other things that do are disproportionately suffered by the black community or Hispanic. That's true. We can talk about that. But the solution is never just to give them a random boost. Like, okay, all the whites get one lower grade until we get all the Asians. Or what Harvard did. Don't let them in. Keep the Asians out so we get more blacks and Hispanics. That's unjust. The Supreme Court rightly found it was illegal. So the way they define, here's the thing though. If you say equity means equality of outcome, they will say, no, it doesn't. They will say, no, all we want is equality of opportunity. They will insist on that. As a resolution passed by the North Carolina State Education Board, which I was consulted about, because the resolution was about equity. So the whole article I read on the Federalist. But again, their claim was all we want is equity, meaning equality of outcome. They said that like 5 times. And the school board came to me, the conservatives and the school board said, this doesn't sound quite right to us. It sounds fishy. Can you read the document again carefully? And I said, sure. Buried in the document was one line after they said equality of opportunity over and over again. They said something like an equity would, if we practice it, would yield equality of outcome. It was one, like you could easily miss it. That was the point. The way equity works is this. You say, I want equality of opportunity. Excellent, we all do. Great. Sounds like equality. No, here's the thing. Ask them this question. This is key. How do you know when equality of opportunity has been achieved? That's the question to ask. And they will answer when outcomes are equal. Their assumption is if you see unequal outcomes, it's because of discrimination. If that were true, by the way, well, then fair enough. Do something to offset the discrimination. But they're assuming it. And that's why they're thrown on the scale and say, okay, we'll just give these people a boost or a deficit until we get equal outcomes. But you have to ask that question. They will swear up and down they only want equality opportunity. They will say that, but ask them, how do you know when it's achieved? And they will tell you when outcomes are equal. So that's the difference. Anyway, our book goes into, we actually document that. It's very, very clear what they're doing. It's a shell game. I am telling you, and they actually quote a video by Kamala Harris when she was campaigning for vice president, where she actually lays that out very clearly. But you have to ask the right question because they will hide behind equality of outcome, which is a good thing, generally speaking. Even that is actually a little bit trickier than you think. But that's your short answer is it is equality of opportunity when you've assumed that it will give you equality of outcome. That's like the tricky way to define it. But yeah, good question. It's very subtle. And again, if you don't know their games, they will trick you. Like the school board was actually confused. They were like, we know it's wrong, but where? I was like, you have good intuition, and here it is. Yeah.
Good, thank you.
As a side note, it was worse than that because not only they smuggled that equality opportunity in, it passed, unfortunately, even despite my article I wrote and my talking to the school board. The other thing they did was they changed, not only they smuggled equity in, the resolution said our whole framework education in North Carolina, 1.4 million students, will be shifted onto an equity framework. That will be our primary lens for thinking about education. Not education, not learning, equity. And like, that's alarming. And then they put all of that power to determine equity, that whole framework, which is now the governing framework for North Carolina, all public schools. They gave all that power to one person, the equity officer, who happened to be co-sponsoring the bill, or something like that, right? Mm-hmm. I'm like, guys, that is insanity. You're literally handing unchecked power to one guy who will now be in charge of the entire framework for the entire public school system, right? And it passed. So I don't know what they're doing with it. I don't know if it got kind of tabled as a resolution. It wasn't a law, but like that's bad. So yeah, we mentioned that in our book, in our new book coming out.
Well, a lot to think about.
Yeah.